More than a decade ago, Tarana Burke was a youth camp director struggling with how to respond to a young camper who shared with her a horrific tale of sexual assault. Belatedly, it occurred to Burke that one of the most helpful things she could have done would have been to say to the girl these two words: "Me too." Today, the Brooklyn-based activist is a program director for Girls for Gender Equity, and her declaration, "Me Too," has become a rallying cry, a statement of support, a way to release people from shame and remove feelings of blame. Thanks to some high-profile supporters encouraging victims of sexual assault to speak out, Me Too has taken on a life of its own, going viral and becoming a catchphrase that sums up an entire movement. There are many, men and women alike, who would like to see this movement fade away. It's an uncomfortable topic, and people of different generations, ethnicities, and genders are struggling to talk about it. Yet many are hopeful that this represents the beginning of a broader shift towards gender equity between women and men, with work and personal relationships based on mutual respect. Today, we welcome 3 panelists with a wide range of experience and expertise to help us explore the topic. I'm going to call them up and ask you to grab a seat up here. First, let's welcome Carrie Blackwood. She's an attorney in private practice with the law firm of Barron, Smith & Doggart here in Bellingham. With 2 decades of knowledge and experience, Carrie's specialty is employment law, including discipline, performance, workplace investigations, and labor relations. She's worked with an ethnically diverse and socially disadvantaged groups as an activist and mentor to achieve social justice. She's a member of the Washington State Bar Association Diversity Committee, volunteers with Law Advocates, and is a longtime mentor for the Fairhaven College Law, Diversity, and Justice program at her alma mater, Western Washington University. She's a graduate of Mitchell Hamline School of Law in Minnesota. Carrie Blackwood. Next, we have Karen Burke, Executive Director of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Services in Whatcom County. Karen was previously employed with the Lummi Nation, where she was Director of the Lummi Nation Tribal Court and helped develop and manage programs including Lummi Drug Court and Lummi Juvenile Justice Project. She was the founding director of the Lummi Nation Child Support Program and also provided domestic violence and sexual assault services in Skagit County. She has degrees from Colorado State University and Western Washington University. And one of her missions is to lead the community towards ending abuses of power. So finally, we have Katie Anthony. She is a blogger, podcaster, and, get this, a drinker of rye, mother of dragons, we met some of them, feminist werewolf, and writer of expletives, which adds a little color there. How's that for a description? She writes about feminism and family on her blog, KatyKatiKate, and co-hosts the weekly podcast, Mouthy, Messy, Mandatory, with Ronit Feinglass Plank. Katie has been a guest on KUOW's The Record with Bill Radke, discussing issues related to feminism, and has also appeared in podcasts for the Shameless Mom Academy, for Crying Out Loud, Cafecito Break, and Inside Voice. Katie lives outside of Seattle with her husband and 2 sons. So we're really grateful that all 3 of you powerful, interesting, talkative, hopefully, women are here to speak with us today. So let's get started. Many of us in this room have experienced or witnessed sexual harassment or abuse in our personal lives or in the workplace. I'd like to start off by asking, why is Me Too happening now? What has been your experience with Me Too, both professionally or personally? And anyone who wants to jump in can go for it, and I'll hand you this.
Well, they're looking at me. I'm not exactly sure why. So why Me Too now? I think part of what's happening is a demographic shift and a power shift in especially workplaces. I mean, it's a little bit difficult because we get into this lingo game, and we have this distinction between the Me Too movement, which is really about sexual violence in every aspect of our lives, whether in our homes, our workplaces. And then you have this this bleed into the workplace because, we're human in all aspects of our experiences, but we have the Time's Up movement, which is really about talking about workplaces, but obviously Me Too bleeds into that. But I think part of what's happening in the workplace, and where this became on the screen of, I think, the general public, was out of this relationship to Alyssa Milano, I can't remember, a tweet, Alyssa Milano's tweet, and also relationship to sexual harassment in Hollywood. But I think in the workplace, we are seeing demographic shifts, both for people of color and women, to have more access to power. And really, sexual violence, it has nothing to do with sex, right? Sexual violence has nothing to do with sex. It's all about violence. And whenever we have situations of hierarchy and oppression and privilege that allow for abuse of folks, it's really about addressing power structures. And so because we see the demographic shift and we see people who've been traditionally oppressed or marginalized gaining power, they're able to, for the first time ever, come forward and say, I'm going to tell you about what happened to me because there may be a glimpse that if I tell you about it, you will not further project violence on me because of me using my voice. So we're nowhere near where we need to be, right? Because and just briefly, but you think about the voice that was brought forward publicly was white affluent women, right? And that's telling you that they're just barely now getting that voice to come forward, because we can talk a little bit about that history. But so imagine that we're nowhere near where we need to be to hear the voice of women and people of color, and really the most affected by sexual violence are those folks who are low-wage workers. And so we're not even close to that conversation. But I think that's part of what's happening as a power shift.
I see Katie nodding. I'll jump, and then we'll go back to Karen.
Yeah, I think, can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Wonderful. So I totally agree with everything that Carrie said in terms of a systemic issue about sexual violence in our culture. I also think we cannot discount the impact of the 2016 election in terms of bringing these issues to the forefront. We have literally this tale as old as time, where you have a woman who is qualified and hardworking, and a man who is unqualified and extremely aggressive and presumptuous and entitled to time and space. You clearly know where I stand on this issue. But it's interesting because this election did kind of bring to the surface this dynamic that many women find very, very familiar, of being bullied, of being spoken over, of being labeled as shrill or bossy or unpleasant to be around just because they have good ideas or a loud voice. And so you have this population of women who's energized by the fact that we have a woman candidate nominated by a major party for the first time in our nation's history, also threatened and alarmed by the other candidate whose stance on women's issues is questionable, to say the least, who is a self-professed assaulter of women who brags about it. And then we have also the emergence of grassroots political organizations after the election, things like Pantsuit Nation and Indivisible and those kinds of organizations that are prioritizing personal storytelling as a way of bridging the empathy gap and as a way of valuing people's voices that wouldn't otherwise be heard. So all of those things together kind of created this perfect storm in which the Me Too movement, which had been, as Christine, I'm so glad, mentioned, Tarana Burke's movement for years before Alyssa Milano tweeted it, all of a sudden it was able to transcend these social and racial and economic barriers that had kept it very isolated in this one population that I personally, as a white woman in Washington, I had no access to Me Too until Alyssa Milano tweeted it. I didn't know that Tarana Burke was doing it. So I think that's why Me Too right now, in a more acute sense.
Karen, how about you? Any thoughts on that?
What they said. And additionally, first I want to thank you all for having us and for opening up this uncomfortable conversation. It is a place that we have to listen and be willing to sit with some pretty uncomfortable realities while we learn more about what this looks like. I am personally elated that the time for Me Too has come. I've been working for 25 years to listen to women primarily tell their stories of sexual violence, and they tell them on deaf ears. And so the real question is why now? Why are we listening? The difference isn't that we're publicly disclosing. The difference is that we're listening and we're actually holding offenders accountable, and sometimes very, very powerful, wealthy offenders. And it's nothing short of miraculous, and the time has come. The shift has come. I do want to make a point because I worry that some of you won't be able to fully listen to this conversation without this point being made, which is that sexual violence is primarily perpetrated by men. 98 to 99% of perpetrators are men, and they perpetrate violence to women and other men whom they seem weaker than themselves, or men who they see that embrace something feminine that they devalue. So there are women who perpetrate. It does occur. It doesn't occur often that there's a woman perpetrator, but that doesn't mean that it's not sexual violence when it's perpetrated by a woman, and that does mean that the victim still needs support and that perpetrator needs to be held accountable. So please understand that this conversation is for all of us. This isn't a men against women conversation. This is a us against sexual violence conversation.
So when the programming committee first started talking about this issue, it was just really at the beginning of the tweets and Alyssa Milano and building some momentum. And we had this question, is this a moment in time or a true cultural shift? And so I'd like to ask each of you, where do you think this is all going? What evidence do you see that suggests that this movement has some staying power, or maybe you think it doesn't?
Well, I'll hop in first here. I think it's really hard to predict because cultural shifts do start as moments in time. And there comes a point where the culture tips over or it doesn't. I think the difference between a moment in time and a culture shift is largely in the way that we respond to it. A moment in time is often something that we find very satisfying to participate in. You know, it's like that 3-minute Upworthy video where there's a sense of resolution. There's a problem, there's a solution, there's some peppy music, and then we can all go home and like check the box on sexual violence or check the box on homeless cats or whatever the issue is that we're trying to solve. And it gives you a warm feeling to participate in a moment in time. Whereas a culture shift is extremely uncomfortable for the people who are participating in it. When you think about shifting your culture, think about all of the pieces that have to go into that. There's a fundamental disruption to the way we relate to each other and the way we move through the world that is going to be uncomfortable, unwelcome, highly criticized, resisted every step of the way. And so the more we meet resistance on this journey, the more I feel confident that it is a culture shift. That, to me, the louder people are fighting against it, the more it matters and the more it clearly is a conversation that needs to happen. You obviously all know about the 1963 March on Washington that was led by Martin Luther King. Recently, a Gallup poll came to light from the 60s that revealed that 60% of respondents did not support the March on Washington because they thought that it would be violent and they thought that it would be counterproductive to the cause of the civil rights movement. And so as we're looking at Me Too, as we're looking at other contemporary social movements like Black Lives Matter, understand that resistance to those movements and the question of whether these tactics are going to be useful, it's old, it's ancient, there's nothing new under the sun. And the more we're fighting against it, the more important those conversations are to have.
Yeah, was looking at a quote from Tarana Burke, and she talks about this is a system of a larger systemic inequality and a systemic pattern of exclusion for women, for people of color, and a lack of equilibrium in the power distribution in all of our businesses. And really, I just want to echo that, because this is so systemic. This notion of the need for each of us, when we have power or privilege, to oppress, and the need to oppress others in whatever form that takes, right? So as women gain power, and if that power shift is happening with white women, and how are we then utilizing that power, and how are we going to perpetuate oppression as we gain power and privilege? So I think part of what is happening is this discussion as part of a bigger discussion about oppression generally and the need to have power over others. And so when we talk about is this sustainable? I don't know. I think it's only sustainable in the context of, are we willing to have a serious conversation about inequity in this country in every single level and get serious about it. I will think that we may be getting there when I show up at a PTA meeting and it's not 97% women. I think that might, or when, I'm seeing it in my home even, that we're challenging every single aspect of gender inequality. And then lastly, I think when we get these moments and where we have this opportunity to secure footing, and you all remember, or at least some of us in this room remember Anita Hill and what she went through, and that was a shark. For those of us I was entering the workforce in 1992, and it was a good reminder to me after working in fast food and cleaning people's homes and being a low-wage worker and experiencing sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. It was a reminder to me, keep your mouth shut. Keep your mouth shut, because not only will we teach you to keep your mouth shut, but the tribunal of your rights will be white and they will be male. So when we had that moment of the 60s, where were we to support Anita Hill? Where have we been since then? So the question is, are we going to get serious about this? And when we have the opportunity, how are we going to secure footing in all issues of equity?
I feel like she just asked me that question and I don't really have a succinct answer. So I'm going to answer the original question. Make no mistake, our culture's changing. There's a new dawn. We may be at the beginning of that new dawn, but we're really starting to look at, first of all, to look with reality, with clear eyes about what does sexual violence look like. We're starting to tell ourselves the truth, that it is an epidemic. It's not individual situations. It's not a he said, she said situation. How many times have you heard that? To discount it. And we start telling ourselves the truth, and we start seeing the problem for what it really is. And we stop believing the myths that allow perpetrators to continue to perpetrate and giving them permission. We're changing the culture. So sitting right here today and listening and being uncomfortable, talking about an uncomfortable topic, but being willing to learn, this is changing the culture. So I believe this is just the beginning, and I'm just so excited.
So Carrie touched on this already a bit, but women in all different walks of life and life experience, they experience harassment and abuse. And for many of them, it's not possible to walk away from a job or a relationship because they need to provide for their family. They may have immigration status issues. They may have a lack of understanding about what their options are, et cetera. And they find it even more difficult to speak out. So is all of this issue about power rather than sex as it is? And how does privilege play into it, and what's the difference between and how they interact? Karen, do you want to start?
I will gladly start. So sexual violence is all about power that's grounded in privilege. So perpetrators use power either by physical force or that the power that's granted to them in society. And that comes in the form of coercion or threats, taking a job away. So the time really has come in our society where we're looking at the ways that we give people power and the ways that they abuse that power. And honestly, I think we're just very, very tired of people in very high places of privilege abusing the power that we as society give them.
Katie.
Yeah, I think the term privilege has kind of become triggering to a lot of people. You know, I have a lot of relatives who are sick of hearing me talk about privilege. And I think it's really important that we define privilege right now. You know, when we talk about your privilege, we're not trying to discredit the hard work that you've done or erase the obstacles that have certainly laid in your path to success. Nobody is trying to say that you haven't earned what you've gotten or that you haven't had to work hard in your life. The most important thing to remember about privilege is privilege is like you're playing a video game on the easiest possible setting. You still have to go through the whole video game. You still have to go pick up your food supplies and, you know, go around the corners and travel through the game. I don't know, I don't play video games. I'm imagining like Mario Brothers. That's the last video game I played. But not everyone gets that setting. Another analogy that I use often is like if we are all in this room together and the people with the most privilege are wearing the most clothing. So if you are a wealthy, straight, white, able-bodied man, you look like the cover of the J. Crew Christmas catalog. You have like a parka and a fisherman's sweater and a beanie and leather boots and, you know, the whole 9 yards. And the temperature in the room is set to keep you comfortable. So the temperature in the room is at like 35 degrees. Now, say there's somebody else in the room who has less privilege, who has less social currency than you do, and they're therefore wearing less clothing in this metaphor. So me, I am an able-bodied, white, straight woman, so I have less privilege. So I'm wearing, you know, a jacket, sneakers, jeans, and a baseball cap. 35 degrees, I'm freezing. I'm freezing my butt off. But the problem with our current system is that nobody is looking around saying, why is this room so cold? I am sitting here thinking, why can't I get warm? What is wrong with me that I can't get warm? Because those guys are fine. And they're looking at me like, what's her problem? It's very comfortable in here. And I'm looking at the people who have even less social power than I do, and who are having to work even harder than I am to stay warm in this room that is not designed for them. And I'm like, come on, guys, you're being a little dramatic right now. It's not that bad. I'm cold too, right? And so what we have to do when we're thinking about privilege is just recognize the things that have been given to you, the clothing that you got to walk into this room with, and look around at everybody else and recognize that not everybody is dressed the same for this temperature. And some people have to work a lot harder to get comfortable in a space that was designed maybe for you.
It's interesting, just on a side note, this morning I had this discussion with my husband about locking the door every time. So he'll step out for a moment and I lock the door every time. Even if he's just walking to the car, it's my instinct. And he gets so frustrated. Why do you keep locking me out? And I said, well, your sense of safety is different than mine. I have concerns what happens when my doors are not locked. I think when we talk about what's happening in access to power and privilege, and talking about these distinctions, I don't know how important the distinctions are, but I know how important the experience distinction is. I was looking, so there's a picture up there of Maricruz Ladino, who is a farm worker activist, and right now there are 500,000 undocumented women working in the fields that produce the food that you just ate. So 500,000 undocumented women working in the fields. According to a 2012 Human Rights Watch report, it was indicated that hundreds, if not thousands, of farm working women every single year are raped in the fields, so much so that it's considered a perk of the job for folks who supervise immigrant women in the fields. And it is known that if you're going to keep your job, you're going to have sex. And then how do you explain to your husband that's also living on the farm with you that you were just raped? And how do you bring those issues forward? They call the fields of Salinas the fields of calzone or the fields of panties because so many supervisors rape women there. The most sacred act that anybody can do is feed you. The people who are feeding you are being raped in the fields. And what are we going to do about that? And what are the systems that perpetuate that? And when will we consider women of color as human? There's another picture up there of Michelle Vinson, who was the first Supreme Court case to talk about sexual harassment being illegal. And I'm sure you all know all these women up there, right? Because they're our heroes. No, you don't know who they are because we heroize people who are not heroes. But this woman was a hero. She brought the first case to the Supreme Court, and she was raped. And the company's argument was there was no financial harm to her, no tangible harm in being raped. It's not violence, and it's not against the law. And that was their Supreme Court argument. So it's the dehumanization that we have to talk about.
Whew. Okay. I'm going to... Maybe this is lightening things. I don't know. Talking about celebrities, because we've been reading in the news every day. There's a different celebrity that's being accused of bad behavior, and it's just constant. Two of the more well-known cases involve Harvey Weinstein and Al Franken. In what ways are the situations of Weinstein and Franken alike, and how are they different? Both for those who are harassed and abused and for the alleged perpetrators and what they are accused of doing.
So I think it's helpful to look at sexual violence as a continuum. You know, on one end, you really have a very uncomfortable sexualized environment and sexual harassment, and it goes all the way to rape and sexualized murder. And there's a lot of violence in between. But don't mistake that all of that behavior stems from the same deep-rooted devaluing of women and everything seen as feminine. So regardless of where it falls on that continuum, it's the same behavior. So I don't see a real difference between the two. And there is, of course, we can argue a difference between which is worse, and there's different impacts on victims. But until we look deeper, we're not going to really uncover what the problem is.
I have an image for the continuum.
She's the artist.
I'm a writer. I have an image. So I want you to pretend that your coworker just ate your lunch. It's so annoying. Okay, your coworker just ate your lunch, and you have to choose how to respond to that coworker. You could either say, "Oh, that's okay. It's fine. I wasn't really hungry," or you could maybe say, like, "Dude, it's the third time this week. Stop eating my lunch." Or, you know, all the way on the other end of the spectrum, you could murder him.
Wow.
But whether you whisper your response or you shout your response, the seed of sentiment remains the same, which is, I hate you, Steve, right? Cut it out, Steve. I think of this as a seed of hostility, and that because, and we're all talking about this up here as if it's a given, and it may not have been something that you've meditated on before, but because we live in a culture that defaults to maleness, femaleness is less important to our culture. And so when a woman takes up space, there is a sense of hostility that we all have toward those women. It's planted in all of us because we are all a product of our time and place. And now that seed, it depends, you know, how you treat that seed is going to affect how big that seed gets, right? So depending on how much you fertilize it, and show it to the light of day, you might turn into a Harvey Weinstein. You might grow a giant hostility tree for women. Or if you don't think about it that much and just let it take root, you might just have a little, hostility sprout toward women that you never really noticed before because it's just in all the other stuff in your garden. But regardless of how big it is, everybody has it. I have it. Hillary Clinton has it. Tarana Burke probably has it, although I don't know her. And it's there in the way that Weinstein assaulted women, and it's there in the way that Franken casually harassed women, and it's there in the way that we talk about the women that were assaulted and harassed. And it's important that we acknowledge that we all have this, and that that's not the same as a damnation. We're not doomed because we have this seed in us. It just means we need to get in our garden and do some weeding. Get in there and be like, whoa, I didn't even realize that was in there, and now I'm gonna pull it out.
Carrie's writing some notes. Do you want to jump in?
Oh, no, I was thinking about, that reminder that each of us here in this room has power and privilege. And it's just that reminder of stepping in with that power and privilege. I just had an experience the other day where I was getting some financial advice with me and a male friend. And in the middle of that financial advice, the financial advisor looked at me and said, if you need to bring in your husband to have this conversation, let me know. And then I was waiting for him to say something about the person sitting next to me. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of assumptions there. One, that I'm married to a man. And second, that this person is
your brain can't handle numbers.
Right.
Yeah.
So then I turned to the person next to me and I said, so are you going to be bringing your wife in for this gentleman who obviously wants a conversation? But that would have been an opportunity for the person sitting next to me with privilege and power in that moment to say, why are you asking her that? Why are you asking her that? So stepping in and using that power and privilege is our responsibility.
That is a great segue to my next question. So some women experience either overt forms of discrimination or harassment or things like sexual innuendos in both the workplace and personal relationships. And men are many times still excused for their behavior because either it's just not a big deal, why are you so sensitive about that, or maybe they're just using locker room talk. What role should men play in the Me Too movement, and how can they be engaged most effectively in the conversation? What can they do?
So I think men should play a key role in the movement. It's really about men. I have to get the little... So I know that you all know this, but I'm just going to state the obvious, that we make up our rules about gender. We just make them up. They're different in certain cultures. They're different in subcultures. That sex is a biological thing. We are all assigned sex at birth based on the physical appearance of our genitals. And if we're, like about 2% of us, have genitals that it's not really very clear, and so usually in those cases the doctor or the parents just assign a sex. And then we start teaching children how to behave based on that physical appearance of their genitals. It's really kind of weird when you uncover it like that. That before someone is even born, we start talking to them and talking about them and telling them how they're going to be in this world. Girls like pink and boys like blue. That's just nonsense, right? Like, how does that even make sense? But in that, additionally, that's kind of an innocent example, but in that, additionally, there's this subversive conversation about what it means to be a man. And I can't speak to it very well because I'm a woman, but from what I witnessed and from having 3 brothers, it's a bit brutal. That men are pretty brutally held to a standard of maleness that is just as unachievable as the standard of femaleness that we're given. And women have taken an opportunity in the last many, many years to question our gender role and to expand our gender role, and we're still working on that. And I'm not sure that men have taken that same opportunity to look at, does it really mean that I have to be violent? Does it really mean that I have to suppress things that are maybe seen as stereotypically feminine in myself, like being emotional or feeling sad or being tender or being in love? those things are kind of seen as weak. And so it's a pretty rough role that men have to play to suppress all of these things that are natural and human, and to only express one half of their humanness. And additionally then to look in a hierarchical and judgmental way on women. And so then we can hardly be surprised. I mean, it's really not fair of us to then be surprised when a man is violent to a woman, or a man is violent to another man that he deems weaker than himself. We've set him up to be that way. And so I think that there's something, and this may feel a little controversial coming from a feminist, but I think there's something about men really looking at changing their own role for the better and for the health of our nation.
I couldn't agree more. So I had only sisters growing up, but then I now have 2 sons. And so it's been a really interesting experience trying to help my sons create a sense of identity that belongs to them and has not necessarily been just handed to them as a complete package because they're little boys. And I remember one of the books that I read about raising boys. It's a wonderful book called Raising Cain, Protecting the Emotional Lives of Boys. And there was a study referenced in this book where where 2 groups of preschoolers, boys and girls, were brought into a room, and they were told that through the window in this room there was a baby. And if the baby started crying, they could speak into a microphone. And here's a dial where you can turn the volume up or down. And here's a switch where you can turn off the noise, so you'll no longer hear the baby crying if you need to. The girls were brought in. Their vital signs were monitored, their heart rate, skin temperature, blood pressure. When the baby started crying, the girls were far more likely to sing to the baby, talk gently to the baby, try to soothe the baby. They didn't mess with the volume. They didn't really turn off the switch. When the boys came in, they were far more likely to yell at the baby to stop crying and turn the switch off very, very quickly. They were like, nope, it's not for me. But what's interesting about that is that we could interpret that as boys don't care about babies. But the vital signs of the boys were off the charts. Their heart rates were pounding. They got hot. Their blood pressure was just going crazy. And the truth is that they cared very, very much about the distress of the child in the next room, but they did not have the tools, even as young as preschoolers, they did not have the tools to articulate that feeling, and so they turned it off. They yelled, and then they turned it off. And if that sounds familiar to anybody in this room, that kind of response to a feeling of empathy that is very uncomfortable, or seeing somebody in pain and wanting to just be like, shut up, go away, that's real. That's rooted in you. That's valid. And it is something that I totally agree with Karen. Your pain deserves to be seen and heard as well, because that's the only way we're going to get better as a culture.
Any thoughts, Carrie?
Yeah, I mean, this is really complicated, right? It's complicated and simple. I think about this quite a bit, of the notion of, do we figure out why it's happening? Do we spend time figuring out why it's happening? Or do we spend time just focused on resistance? And I read about this through the experience of the Holocaust, and folks were talking about and really telling the experience of the Jewish Holocaust as a privilege, right? Because there were many Holocausts, and the ability to tell the story is a sign of privilege as well. But to have the story of the Holocaust, and they would talk about, we could see it was coming, and we kept talking about, why are people this way, and why would they do this, and why is Trump the way he is, and why, and we did not spend the time we needed instead in the resistance of it. And so how much conversation we need to have about why it's happening versus what we're going to do about it, I don't know, but this is something I puzzle with. I think what's true at this point is that I am powerful and I am privileged, and I'm spending a whole heck of a lot of time figuring out how I oppress others, and that we are all called upon to do that. And every person in this room who is oppressing somebody in some way has work to do, and that work only starts from inside of us, right? The only change we can make is right here. And as much external focus as we're putting, I don't know, but there's work for us to be doing.
I have one more thing actually that to that end, because I think it is important to give kind of practical advice. I think one of the best things that we can do individually is take an inventory of the voices that we've invited into our lives. When you go home, look at your Netflix queue. What shows are you watching? What movies are you watching? What podcasts are you listening to? What books are you reading? Whose voices are you valuing with your consumption and your time and your energy? How many of your shows are about women? How many of your books are by women? And not all of them have to be eating your vegetables, taking your medicine. Like Broad City is a great show, and it's very funny. Okay, I mean, there's Blackish and Fresh Off the Boat are fantastic network comedies about people of color. The only way that we bridge that empathy gap that we've been talking about, where we tend to see people who are not like us as less human, the only way to start to see those others as human as we are, and to say, if it's unacceptable for me, it's also unacceptable for you, is to get to know those people. And it's just as simple as expanding your consumption of media to begin with. Take an inventory, invite new voices.
As a librarian, I'll say we've got lots of library books for you. And we'd be happy to recommend diverse reads for you. So please, WCLS.org. So I know we have lots of people here who I'm sure have good questions. I'd like to kind of end my questions of you on a real positive note, speculate a little bit on the good things that could be coming because of the rise in prominence of the Me Too movement. What is happening in your professional or personal lives that leads you to think, I'm hoping, that positive changes are coming? Where do you think this movement will take us 5 to 10 years from now, and what can each of us do to move the conversation along?
Well, I have two things. One is that culture change is easy. It's really pretty easy. Think about seatbelts. So I know it's kind of a simple example, but there was some really strong resistance to our requirement of using seatbelts. We didn't want to. We have a very long love history with, the freedom on the road, and we're an extremely independent people, and the idea of seatbelts just constrained us, and we didn't like it. And, how many people have memories of riding in the back seat, building a blanket fort and that kind of thing, sitting on your dad's lap while he drove, all these things that we are just unheard of today. And that has been a really short period of time. So again, I know it's a more simple example than looking at these deep roots of gender violence and gender bias, but it's possible. I really need you to believe that it is absolutely possible. And the second thing, it relates to that and is a story that I have some foster children. Right now I have four little foster children. They're all under the age of 7. And I only have them part-time right now. They're being placed back with their mom, and so we've actually kind of adopted mom too, and we're friends with this whole family. But the little children were over, and Gracie and her 2 brothers. Gracie is 4.5, and her 2 brothers. One is a baby, so he doesn't count. She has 3 brothers, but he was doing nothing. But I'm crying, but that's a different story. One is 3 and the other is 7. So we've got Gracie, 4.5, 3, and 7. And I've been really working with them on being permission-based in their play. So I'm teaching them about consent. So, they like to run up to one another and just push each other down. And they consider that play. And so they now have to, at least at my house, ask permission. Baker, would you like to wrestle? Gracie, would you like to play? Can I take this toy from you? That one never really gets a yes, but. So they had permission and they were playing, and I've also tried to teach them, and we're working really hard on it, that when one of them says no, you have to stop, even if it's fun. Even if you are liking what you're doing, you must stop. That changes the world right there. But let me tell you the mistakes I make. So they're playing, they've had permission. I'm so proud. Look at what I've done. I'm teaching them these great things. And they are wrestling, and I'm in the room with probably the baby crying, and I hear, because 4 kids is insane. I just want you to know that, especially when they're on their 7. But Gracie starts screaming at the top of her lungs, stop, stop, stop. And my response to her, I'm in the other room, I don't see what's happening, is to say, Gracie, stop screaming. Think about that. And when I look up, I realize what's happening is her brothers are holding her down. It's all in play, they're wrestling. But the message that I've just sent, and so we all have this, this participation, if you will, in this culture of sexual violence accidentally. You know, now I was able to stop that and say, Gracie, please, whenever something is happening, scream, and boys, you have to stop. You know, we could amend that and repair that. But when that's happening all the time, but the good news is that because we all participate, we can all unparticipate. It's up to us. We get to make a choice about what role we play in ending sexual violence. We get to make that choice. And so I leave you with the question, what choice are you going to make? Carrie, your thoughts?
So I'm very grateful to have a special guest here tonight. My daughter Paloma is in the room. Recently at school, and I'm going to call her out here a little bit, they were asked, they were in a group, and they said, okay, we want boys on one side and girls on the other, and she stopped everything and said, why? So it starts there, right? It starts with the questioning, and of course, she is my hope. And I also think in my professional life, I have the privilege through affirmative action, I want to say and be very clear about, to be an attorney, and the only reason why I'm here is because of affirmative action. Let's be clear. Thank you, Marie Eaton and others. But right now there's a lot happening in the law, and part of that's because there's increasing representation in women in the houses of power. We're not where we need to be nationally or locally. I was reminded by an African-American friend of mine that currently the demographics of the national leadership would allow for his rights to vote to be elected out, and he knows that power is not in his hands, and he fears that right now. It came across during his lifetime and could end during it, and that's the fear that communities hold. But also during this time, we have developed in Washington State paid family and medical leave. Raise your hand if you know that paid family medical leave is available to you starting in 2020. All right, that's awesome. A lot of people don't know that's coming. We also had on the 11th of April, the Ninth Circuit decided the Rizzo case. How many heard about the Rizzo case coming through? All right, people, you got to get out there. The Rizzo case, April 11th, said that in the Ninth Circuit, which covers Washington State and the Northwest region, that you cannot be asked what your previous salary was prior to being hired, so that you have the right to negotiate a wage based on the work that you will do, not the oppression that you have experienced. There's also new Washington laws that protect our right to talk about sexual harassment in the workplace and prevent policies that would do that and protect us from being hidden in our struggle through arbitration and other means that hide our voice. And we are also seeing a national move to protect those in transgender status who still are not protected everywhere in this country from violence in the workplace. So I have hope in those. And also, if you're out there trying to learn about the plight of low-wage workers, check out Rape in the Fields and Rape on the Night Shift, two opportunities to connect with the communities that serve you.
So I think one of the things that I'm most excited about is the increased representation for women, as you were saying, in our houses of power. I looked up a couple of statistics here. Emily's List, the organization that recruits and trains pro-choice Democratic female candidates, in 2015 to 2016, they had 900 women reach out to them to ask about training and to prepare to launch campaigns. Since Trump's election, 26,000 women have reached out to Emily's List. Yes, yes. And there are at least 494 women, both Republican and Democrat, running for Congress. And of 36 gubernatorial races in 2018, 35 will have female candidates. So regardless of the outcomes of those races, I mean, obviously, we want the outcomes to be outstanding, but regardless of the outcomes of those races, it is important that women are taking the opportunities that are provided to them, and more women are saying to themselves, why not me? Instead of having a conversation in your head of like, well, I don't know enough about politics. I'm just a teacher. I'm just a nurse. Teachers and nurses are running for Congress and governor, and that is freaking exciting. I'm really into that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to sneak in another question, and I hope everybody's thinking of their questions. We'll have some people with microphones coming around so we can take the questions. But as we're getting that set up, I'm going to get one more out here. Have you noticed in your life that people of different ages are responding differently to the Me Too movement in different ways? And why do you think that might be?
I can speak a little bit to this. For about 15 years, I represented organized labor, and oftentimes in the fields of professional and technical, engineers, IT, and whatnot. I definitely find that there is a need for the dominant demographic and then engineering workforce, I'm trying, how do I say this, to hold on to power. And a lot of fear about letting go of that power. And I think, organized labor, the intent is to have power together and collectively. So I definitely think that there's a challenge there. What I'm concerned about with younger folks of power coming into the workforce is they're staying silent, and that's concerning. And they're watching from cues from the power structure. So they're looking up and saying, okay, if I see discrimination, if I was in a meeting recently and I was on the phone and it was a group of men, and they were talking, and all powerful men within the organization, and they spent the first 10 minutes of the conversation talking about a woman that was attractive in a meeting that was prior. And so I began texting the men in the meeting and talking about, not only was that an issue for me, because now you're putting me in the position of having to call you out even though you're my boss, and second, you're putting me in the position that I'm talking about this instead of what we were come here to meet for. And the response to that was not for them to then they started apologizing to me on the phone, because then it became about their feeling embarrassed about their actions instead about what was occurring. Instead of saying in the meeting, this just happened, I'm going to take responsibility for it, and it's not going to happen again. So every young man that was in that room was witnessing a cue of what was appropriate, was okay, and the men that held the power and the privilege in that room refused to let go of it. They decided instead that their own embarrassment was more important than the power and the issue of what was occurring in the room. So I'm not seeing that where we need to be in our power structures to step outside of our comfort and understand that your comfort becomes my discomfort. If your foot is on my neck, let's talk about that with your foot off my neck, right?
Yeah. There's an image.
I do think it's really important for as much as we talk about, the next generation coming up and having a lot of hope and optimism in that generation. It's important to remember that they are inheriting the world that we inherited and built along with the people who came before us. I don't know how many of you saw this photo that recently went viral of a young man asking his date to prom. He had a sign for her that said, "If I was black, I'd be picking cotton, but since I'm white, I'm picking you for prom." This is a teenager. This is a teenage boy, okay? Yeah. And so it is important to recognize that it's not as simple as racism's basically over in a generation. No, that's not how oppression works. Systems of oppression are largely invisible to the oppressors because they're not aware that they're stepping on necks. Systems of oppression are inescapable for the oppressed because their necks are being stepped on. And as we're communicating between generations, it's important for young people not to get too cocky, like I'm the future. And it's important for older generations to remember that it's not too late to acknowledge exactly what you said. Take responsibility for whatever attitudes you've had that you may have passed on to your children. When you know better, do better, and pass that on.
Great. Karen, if you want to jump in, or we can move to
These ladies are
questions.
so great. I just don't know how to like say something magical after they're so amazing. I do want to make a note that rape and sexual violence statistically impacts younger women and younger men far more than older generations. Now, many of us have already experienced sexual violence in our younger ages, and so it impacts us as well. But we've all grown up in this culture where sexual violence is a normalized and almost kind of expected part of growing up. And I mean that in the ways that, you know, how many people have experienced like bra snaps in schools, or, you know, crotch grabs, pardon my language. So I think that our kids deserve more, and I think that our kids are standing up now and saying to us, we don't want to inherit this normalized systems of oppression that we have, and that's why they're marching, and they're saying loud and clear to us, we want things to change, and we're going to make it different. So I do think they are responding differently than we have in the past.
Great. Let's turn it over to questions. Who has a question from the audience? Okay. Our microphone, is there one on this side?
Is this microphone working?
Yes.
Okay.
And while we're waiting for that question, I'm just going to give you a shameless plug. On your tables, there are flyers for an event that DVSAS is holding on Friday, where we're going to be continuing this conversation. And it's called Victory Over Violence, and it's here at Northwood at 11 o'clock. 11:30, and we have already about 200 people registered, but this room can hold more, so if there are folks that are interested, we'd love for you to join us more for this conversation.
Great. Okay, question here.
Not so much a question. My name is Ann Mossinas, and for years I was in the maritime and fishing industry, so this has been a topic for those of us who work in non-traditional fields. So in '88, I brought a study addressed to the Coast Guard, Congressman Lowry, Congressmember Unsold, Barbara Boxer. A lot of people worked to get a law passed Congress based on this report. This is the information needed to assess the extent of sexual assaults on ships. Exxon was the worst. I mean, this is corporate dominance. We're living in an era where we have, you know, dominance towards our planet, dominance militarily, gun violence. So with us, back in that era, when someone was raped on an Exxon tanker, there were 8 complaints in the personnel files against one seafarer, and nothing was done. So this is hugely, deeply systemic in our corporations. Sadly enough, we thought there was going to be some progress made. We got a law passed Congress that required skippers to report assault. 1,300 copies of this study were destroyed. We were told for lack of interest. So it comes, you know, someone made that decision in the, you know, government reporting office. So it just comes back again and again. But one of the good things I do want to share, the younger women. This says the strength of the tides are hers also. And so they're stepping up, and they need our support. And some of them are here, you know, in our coastal community. Thanks.
I've been hearing a lot about corporate responsibility for the problems that we're discussing. I'm wondering to what extent capitalism itself is a root cause of what we're talking about this morning.
So they look to the unionist. I don't know. You know, I'm not an economist. I'm an activist. You know, I think this notion, obviously, of growth is ridiculous, and lack of sustainability is ridiculous. And we really, right now, we're in this wonderful opportunity where all systems are collapsing, and what a beautiful place to be, because all the systems need to collapse because they're not working for us. And so, you know, when we talk about capitalism and violence, we know that capitalism, anytime you're trying to benefit off the backs of others, right? That's a form of violence. And it's perpetuated in our current colonialism of Central America and in other places. So, I mean, capitalism is just another form of oppression, right? And it's one of our systems that we have to look at and say, how does this perpetuate a harm to the other who is no separate from us?
This is a very simplistic question, but one that's bothered me as a female. what message, excuse me, message are we sending to our daughters when they're getting married and they're taking their husband's name? To me, it's you losing your sense of identity. And this continues and no one ever questions it. And I just wondered about that.
I did take my husband's name when I got married. My maiden name was Small. Middle name is actually Young, interestingly enough. So I was Kathleen Young Small. Are you going to be Katie Old Big when you get older? No, I'm not. It's such an interesting question because there is so much that feels right in terms of women reclaiming identities, women, for some of us for the first time, staking out an important aspect of our identities, our names. I think it's also extremely important to make enough space in this conversation for every woman to make that choice for herself. So your daughter getting married, if you just want to have that conversation with her of, you don't have to take his name if you don't want to. There are lots of people who do not take their husband's last names. They keep their own name. It could be that her sense of identity is not at all locked up in that last name and that she's able to kind of maintain who she is and she just maybe likes that last name better. I definitely still feel very, very close to my family. I don't feel like my identity was compromised by taking my husband's last name, but I also have friends who did not take the last name because they did feel that it would be a trespass. They did feel that it was a compromise they were not willing to make on their identity. So I think it comes down to trusting women to make their own choices.
Well, I must say this. I'm thoroughly confused. This whole miasma, this whole business is just, in a way, it's overwhelming, okay? Well, first of all, let's get down to basics. Testosterone and physical size, strength of the male, how much does that enter into the so-called power that a male engenders over women, okay? Number one. Number two, I don't like using the word power because when we say we're empowering women or empowering men, that means we're putting them in a position that they can rule over other people.
I respectfully disagree about the word power. I do understand the connotation, but I think we can have personal power and we can be in a position of power where we're not ruling over someone. So I do believe that, but I understand what you're asking, and the kind of imbalance of power is what I think is really difficult. I don't think the physical differences between men and women, or the physical size, plays a big role in sexual violence at all. I think the biggest role is, again, what you're talking about around oppression and around abusing the power and the privilege that's given to you.
There's a great expression that I think of a lot, which is when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And so when we're talking about power, when you are accustomed to having as much of it as pleases you, and you are suddenly put in a position of equality with someone that you're used to being able to control, that feels like you lost something. It feels like something bad just happened to you. And in a sense, you did lose something. You lost that ability to control another human being. Right? I do really want to thank you because I think it is such an uncomfortable conversation to have, and it's really, really easy for people, for white people to get defensive in conversations about race and for men to get defensive in conversations about sexual violence. And I think expressing feelings of discomfort or wanting to confront something that's bothering you, it gives other people permission to do the same thing. So I thank you very much for your question.
So I see three capable, passionate women up here. When are you going to run for office?
I swear way too much to run for office. I've been keeping it really clean up here, but it's been hard.
There are pictures. I don't know.
My response to this is a simple one. When you're really ready for me to run for office, I think that this community is not necessarily ready. But when you're ready, I'm willing.
Yes.
So one of the things that I'm a little surprised hasn't been addressed is the concept that we have of marriage, in which the male is the head of the household and the woman promises to love, honor, and obey whether or not she takes his name. And my question is whether you think this is a driving force for the dominance in the culture or an excuse for people who would otherwise be dominant to abuse. Does that make sense?
I think that our construct and our concept of marriage is absolutely rooted in our construct and concept of gender. So I think we learn that from a very young age, that women are more subservient, and we use it almost as it's naturally so. You know, you mentioned the testosterone. Men are just naturally violent and women are just naturally weak. And we've learned through science that those things actually are not true, at least not to the extent that we make them up. So I think that the way that we have traditions around marriage is just a symptom of the way that we see gender.
There are different ways to look at this Me Too, right? One is as a movement, and that's mostly what we've been talking about. And I think for a lot of people, the movement has been empowering because it has given voice to these actions or things that have taken place in the past. It also strikes me that a lot of people, many people that I know, never took this opportunity to be a time to share this for whatever reason. And I just wonder, maybe this is especially for Karen, is this more painful, more difficult for people who see this happening but don't see themselves as actors in it, ready to step up? Or have you seen an uptick maybe in people who are talking about things from their past and getting support that they need that they maybe haven't until now?
I've definitely seen an uptick. When we see on television and we see and read in our newspapers that survivors are telling their story and people are listening, and people are believing them. It may not be that somebody's ready to tell that story, but it makes it a safer playing field for when they are ready to tell that story. Because we have not seen that in the past. We've seen Anita Hill, right? We've seen terrible things when women tell their story. So I just think it's so, it's just such a bright light for survivors. And the other day I have a dear friend that I've known for 24 years, and we were together and we were talking about the media and Me Too and, you know, what's going on. And we told each other for the very first time, a 24-year friendship, that each of us were survivors of attempted rape when we were in college. And we'd never talked about that. And until we talk about it and open that up, we really can't heal, not only personally, but as a community. So I just see it as, although it can be painful and it can bring things up, and we want to make sure people, when they tell their stories, have a place for support, I just see it as a beautiful opportunity.
Hi. My husband and I were a great team for many years, but we had an ongoing war, which I call the thermostat war. I finally got down to the bottom of the problem, which is that he had it on a comfort level, and when I put it up to mine, it was wasting resources. Costs too much, whatever. But what happened was that I stood face to face with this wonderful man, and I told him, half of that thermostat is mine. I paid for it. I deserve to have control half the time. And if you are too warm, take off your clothes.
Yes.
I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on how religion plays a role in this.
Just go for it.
Ooh, almost out of time.
Well, Katie jumped right away on politics, so I feel like I'll take one for the team on religion.
I thought you were about to throw me under the bus. Okay, go ahead.
No, and what I'm going to say is relatively simple, is that religion is a construct as well, and religion is, again, made out of our cultures. That even the way that we interpret religious texts are subject to our cultural perspectives. And so again, as in marriage, it is the way that we perceive and the way that we celebrate or the way that we choose to worship whoever we deem as our God is a construct, and it's made up from, again, this idea of what gender means.
I do actually want to add something.
Oh,
I thought
look
of
at that.
something.
She wanted to.
I volunteered. I totally agree that you know the religion that you embrace is interwoven completely in the fabric of the society where that religion has found a home. I think it's really, really important as we talk about religions other than Christianity, that we maintain a sense of respect for other cultural values, because, for example, the Inuit people hunt seals. And this is a sacred relationship that these people have with their environment. And this is not something that, you know, certain animal rights activists want to continue, but it is not for us to say how these people have a relationship with their environment in a form of spirituality and faith that has existed for far longer than I have or you have. And so in as much as we want to own our own personal relationship with religion and make sure we're taking responsibility for that, we have to make sure to be respectful and not put kind of our own lens over other religions whose cultural significance we don't know. Does that make sense?
Carrie, I can see you're taking notes.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting topic, right, about religion and how it's used to perpetuate oppression. You know, anything that's created by man has the opportunity to be used to oppress, whether, you know, obviously religion has justified human slavery, it's justified gender oppression, it's justified violence in all forms. So anything can be used to oppress, and religion has a responsibility, but really it's, you know, they say it's not the gun, it's the human mentality behind it, right? So I feel like it's like that with religion too. Are you using religion like a gun to hurt other people? And then it gets into that conversation of power. And the question that you have to ask as each individual is, who has the power to decide whether this is going to happen to me or not? And when it goes about our mobility in life, is religion being used to remove the opportunity for an individual to decide? And if it is, I question that, I resist that, no matter what form it takes.